Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 2 of the course. I hope everybody is doing well. We've kind of moved past the introductory material, and now we're actually going to start talking about some of the theories. First, I wanted to say that I appreciate you posting your introductions last week. It was really interesting to hear what people were up to and to see some of the videos and to be able to put a face with the name. I think that's really going to be really helpful once we actually start getting into the discussions this week. So the way this week is going to work is, obviously it's broken up into modules again. There's a module overview. Definitely read that before you get started. But we're going to start doing the small group discussions this week. So there'll be this video. There's a reading. There's a reading from Hobbes's Leviathan, which is where we're going to start. And there's a movie that goes along with that. So we're trying to see sort of Hobbes's theory that we're looking at. And in this particular case, it's Hobbes' theory that man's natural state is a state of war against each other, and we're going to watch that play out in the movie The Road, which is based on a book by Cormac McCarthy, and it's essentially what society looks like in the absence of some sort of sovereign government. Right? It's the breakdown of the state essentially, and what man's life looks like in the breakdown of the state. So there's going to be the reading from Hobbes, there's going to be the movie, and then there's going to be a discussion question. I'm going to break you guys up into small groups for the discussion, so you won't be doing it like you did your intros where there were, 35 of you or whatever. In this case, there'll probably be about 5 or 6 in a group. I'll post so the discussion question will be posted on Wednesday to give you guys time to do the reading and watch the film. And I'll post the small group assignments at the same time. I'll post those on Canvas, and I'll post them in an announcement so you guys can actually check that out. So then I'll post that on Wednesday. You'll have until Friday or 48 hours to respond to my question. And then you'll have until midnight on Sunday to respond to one of your classmates. So that's kind of the way the week is going to work, right? And that's the way that traditionally the class is going to work. Okay, so this week we're talking about Hobbes. I have posted a PowerPoint slide on Canvas as well under Module 2. If you guys want to just follow along with that, I'm going to go through the slideshow really quickly here. This is just going to be a brief intro to Hobbes. I don't want to sort of spoil everything. I want you guys to actually have the experience of reading it yourselves and coming to your own conclusions. I don't want to answer all the questions because I want you guys to hash those out in discussions. But here we go. So we're going to start with Hobbes, right? So Thomas Hobbes and the State of Nature. Okay, so we started off with a quote here, Hobbes on human nature. This is actually important, right? Hobbes says that government is necessary not because man is naturally bad, but because man is by nature more individualistic than social, right? So Hobbes doesn't think that, the state of nature is a state of war because people are evil. He thinks it's just the case because people are self-interested. And because people are self-interested, that leads to sort of these debates, right? Or these contests between them. So who was Hobbes as a guy, right? Well, Hobbes lived in the 16th and 17th century, right, which is a very important time period for 2 reasons. One, it was sort of during the scientific revolution, right? So we're kind of coming out of, the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, things like that, and getting more into this period of where people were trying to provide scientific explanations for things. Think about guys like Galileo, people like that, right? And Hobbes thought that there was a way that you could take sort of Galileo's scientific method, right, and apply that to politics. And you could explain human nature in a scientific way. So in a lot of ways, people will refer to Hobbes as sort of one of the first social scientists, right? I mean, you could go back to Aristotle and people like that and say that he was also a social scientist, but maybe one of the first modern social scientists would definitely be Hobbes, right? So that was one of the major important events that was going on during Hobbes' life. The other was that Hobbes actually lived during the English Civil War, right? And he actually saw, it was the Glorious Revolution, right, where Cromwell and his guys were sort of overthrowing Parliament, right, and royalty in a lot of ways. So Hobbes actually saw the English state sort of disintegrate in front of his eyes, which is important when you're looking at sort of some of the theories that Hobbes is trying to use to explain life, in a society without a government, right? Because Hobbes was kind of seeing that play out in front of his own eyes. So that definitely informed Hobbes's theories. Obviously, Hobbes was British, right? He was a pretty well-to-do guy. He served as a personal tutor for one of the major families in England, the Cavendish family. Friends with Galileo, as I mentioned, which sort of influenced his sort of mechanistic, scientific approach to human nature and to politics. He also corresponded with Descartes, who was another one of the René Descartes, one of the major figures in sort of the scientific revolution. And as I mentioned, he lived sort of during the English Civil War. Intellectually speaking, Hobbes most famous for Leviathan, right, which is what we're actually reading from this week, just one chapter. It's a huge book. Probably the most influential work of modern political philosophy. I mean, this is sort of, if you're studying modern political philosophy, political theory, this is where you generally start, is with Hobbes' Leviathan, right? It's sort of the starting point for our conversations about political theory. But he wasn't just sort of a political thinker. He wrote all sorts of treatises on different subjects, ranging from metaphysics to physiology. Right. Another really important component of Hobbes, and why he may have actually ended up in this particular theory regarding man's natural state, was that he was actually the first person to translate Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War into English. Right. And Thucydides himself held very similar beliefs regarding human nature and, why governments are necessary and things like that. There's a very famous piece from Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War called the Melian Dialogue. Right, and it's a dialogue between the Athenian generals and a small island of Melos and the sort of the council people of Melos. Right, and essentially the Athenians are saying, look, we got the power, we can do whatever we want to do, we're going to conquer you. The Melians are appealing to the gods, to their ally, all these reasons, justice, right? All these reasons that they shouldn't be overtaken by the Athenians. But Thucydides is a pretty strong believer of and sort of this notion of might makes right regarding justice and politics. Got this picture here. It's a picture of Leviathan. This is the original cover of Leviathan when it was first published. It's very famous because, as you can see, sort of his notion of the sovereign state is represented in this body. You have this gigantic body that's composed of all these different individuals, right? So it's the notion that there is a sovereign, but the sovereign's power is sort of rooted in the people. Hobbes is well known for sort of the idea of the social contract. This is sort of one of the first places that shows up. And the quote that's written up there is I won't try to do it in Latin because I would butcher it, but it's from Job. There is no power on earth to be compared to him. Obviously, Job was referring to God. In this case, Hobbes. Hobbes, still writing in a fairly religious time, he could make the argument that he was referring to God as well. But if one has read the text of Leviathan, they know that the power that Hobbes is referring to is the power of the sovereign, the power of the state. Okay, so Leviathan. Why did Hobbes actually write Leviathan? Well, up until this point, sort of the justification for the state primarily came from religion, right? So sort of the divine right of kings. The justification for the state is based upon God and somebody's relationship to God, right? And Hobbes actually wanted to create sort of a secular justification, right, for a government. Right? And the way that he does that is he invites us to consider a thought experiment. And this thought experiment is something that Hobbes calls the state of nature. Right? And what he means by the state of nature is a place of perfectly private judgment where there is no recognized authority to arbitrate disputes between two parties. Right? So essentially everybody's left to their own devices. There is no mediating body. Like, let's say that you and I have a disagreement. Essentially, it comes down to we have to settle it between ourselves. There's no third party to settle that dispute between us. So that leads us into a place of conflict between each other, right? Okay, so I just want to briefly lay out the argument that Hobbes presents for this notion. His conclusion that he's ultimately going to reach is that the state of nature, this place of perfectly private judgment, is a place of war, right? It's a state of war, right? So, and that may sound extreme, right? We don't like to think of each other in the state of nature as being constantly at war with one another, but Hobbes lays out several premises that are difficult to deny, and the idea is if you agree to all these particular premises, you should be able to come to the conclusion that state of nature is a state of war. Okay, so here we go. Premise 1. Hobbes says that nature has made mankind equal in the faculties of body and mind. Right? So that raises the question of what exactly does Hobbes mean by equal? Right? We're obviously not all equal. I mean, obviously, I'm not as smart as Stephen Hawking or some sort of Nobel Prize winning physicist. So we're certainly not equal in that way. Similarly, I can't play basketball like LeBron James. So we're not equal in body either. Right? So that raises this question: what does Hobbes mean by equal? He gives us definitions in Leviathan. Right? So regarding physical strength, Hobbes says that even the weakest person has the strength to kill the strongest, either by secret machination or confederacy with others, right? So even if I'm not as strong as somebody else, I can be sneaky and kill them, or I can join with other people and kill them, right? So that's what he means by equal as far as strength goes. And he says that in mind, he finds an even greater equality than strength, right? He says that it's only vanity that leads us to believe that this is not true, right? To think that we're so far advanced in our intellect than other people, right? And he says, he has this quote, "There is no greater sign of equal distribution of anything than that every man is contented with his share," right? So, and, Hobbes says, we're pretty egotistical people, right? We all tend to think that we're geniuses. We all tend to think that we're smart, right? So Hobbes think that's a good sign that there is, in fact, this sort of equal distribution of intellect, right? So that's premise 1. Premise 2, Hobbes says, based on this equality of mind and body, we are equally justified in the hope of attaining our ends, right? So if we're primarily equal in strength, we're primarily equal in intellect, then that gives us all sort of an equal belief that we can accomplish what we want to accomplish, right? And Hobbes says the thing that we primarily want to accomplish as human beings is, our own self-preservation, right? And the things that we think are necessary or that contribute to our self-preservation. So security, primarily. Okay. Premise 3. So Hobbes takes the last premise and says, since we are equally justified to pursue our ends, if any two people desire the same thing, which they cannot both enjoy, right? So we're talking about limited resources here. It's this notion of a zero-sum game. If I win, you lose, right? Then they become enemies, right? So if two people desire the same thing that they're both entitled to, right, because they have sort of equal capabilities, and they can't both have it, then they become enemies who will endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. Right? So if we're both equally entitled to something, we're both equally capable of doing it, and we want it, then that's going to make us enemies, right? Okay. Premise 4, based on this contentious relationship with other people, there is no way for an individual to secure themselves, right? We're living in a state of sort of constant fear, and as we saw, anybody can kill anybody, and if we all want the same things, then that puts us in a very, very precarious situation. So Hobbes' conclusion from those premises is that since there is no individual security, the state of nature is a constant state of war of every man against every man, right? And Hobbes has some pretty technical definitions of what he means by war and peace. Hobbes says that war is not just fighting, but it's also when the will to fight has been expressed and there's no assurance to the contrary, right? So it doesn't just have to be sort of the fighting that's going on between people, but living in this state where there have been no assurances that people are not going to kill you is also a state of war. And he defines peace as all other times, right? So a pretty bleak picture of man's natural state and humanity in general. Right? And then Hobbes leads into this very famous passage where he's talking about the consequences of man living in the sort of state of nature. Right? He says in the state of nature there can be no economy. Right? We can't have we can't build economies because we can't collaborate. Right? We can't work together because we're constantly afraid that the person we're working with is going to steal from us. They're going to stab us in the back, etc. There can be no culture, right? Because we're not going to have shared values. We're not going to have shared beliefs because we can't come together and talk about those things because we're afraid. There's no architecture. There's no building of anything. There's no new knowledge created. There's no art. Essentially, all you have in the state of war is this sense of perpetual fear of a violent death, essentially, right? We're all very scared that somebody's going to kill us in a violent way. And that leads Hobbes to his conclusion where he says the life of man in the state of nature is solitary. Right? So you're living by yourself. It's poor. We're all living on, very meager, the things that we can scavenge. It's nasty, right? Brutish and short. Short being the key phrase there, right? We don't live long in our natural state, right? So Hobbes thinks if we sort of start with this thought experiment of the state of nature, where there is no sort of body to mediate, this is where we end up, right? Our lives are lonely, they're dirty, they're filled with deprivations, and we die quickly, right? So that's Hobbes' justification for why we need a government, right? And Hobbes says, just in case you disagree with me on this, right, if you think that man is actually much more noble than the picture that I've laid out, he lays out some things that he wants you to consider, right? So Hobbes asks you these particular questions, right? So when you take a trip, let's say, for example, you're going out to walk late at night, you're walking to a friend's house or something like that. Do you feel safe to go unaccompanied, right? And maybe this is different between men and women, right? It could be. When you leave your house, do you lock the door, right? Do you lock the door when you leave the house? Do you try to secure your house? And if so, why, right? Why do you, if man is a noble creature, why do you think it's necessary to lock your door? Why do you feel like it's necessary to have somebody accompany you out on a late walk, right? Through sort of maybe an unsavory area, right? If you're in your house, do you lock your valuables away? Do you have a safe, right? Why do you do all these things? And Hobbes would his retort to your sort of belief that man is more noble than this is he says, do you not accuse mankind as much by your actions as I do by my words, right? So you may say that you think man is more noble, but by locking your door, locking your chest, having a friend go with you when you walk somewhere, you're making the exact same accusation that Hobbes claims to be making in his thought experiment. So that leads to this question of, does the state of nature actually exist, right? Is this something that, was there a time, 2,000 years ago where this was actually the thing that was happening, or is it a thought experiment? Well, for Hobbes, it is a thought experiment, right? Primarily, he's not trying to make it sort of an anthropological, argument that this is the way that governments are actually formed. This is more of a philosophical exercise. But he does point to some examples where he thinks it is the case that the state of nature exists. The first point that he makes is that sovereign governments, so governments all over the world, all the states of the world, right, are constantly in the state of nature, state of war against each other. That's because there's no sort of mediating body or body that is actually sovereign over the states themselves. Think of the United Nations, for example. That's an attempt to try to create a mediating body, but obviously it doesn't hold the same power, the same sway that a government like the United States holds over its own citizens, right? So there is no mediating influence, and that's why, a lot of people in international relations would make that on the international stage, we're in a constant state of war against each other, right? There's this notion of the noble savage, right? So when Hobbes was writing this was sort of, when America was being discovered, and, the reports are coming back of the Native American tribes and how they were constantly, fighting against one another, tribalism, things like that. And then finally, this is something that Hobbes actually witnessed himself, is when states devolve into civil war, right? So when there's a civil war, when the sort of the structures and institutions of a government start failing, you see the state of nature actually play out. And I don't know if you guys remember things like, Hurricane Katrina, things like that, where there was, massive looting going on, sort of the rule of law kind of breaks down. You can see very quickly that people can resort to some unsavory things. Last thing, Hobbes makes this argument, there's no such thing as justice in the state of nature, right? He says the notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have no place in the state of nature. And this is the argument that he makes, where there is no common power, i.e. there's no sort of one body that we can turn to adjudicate things. There's no law, right? There's no law without a sovereign state. And he says where there is no law, there is no injustice, right? So in other words, if you don't have laws that dictate what is right or wrong, then there's no wrong, right? There is no right, there is no wrong. Now you can make arguments that Hobbes is looking at this from a more of a legalistic perspective than a moral perspective, right? But if you go back to the thing Hobbes was talking about having no culture in a society, no shared beliefs, no shared values, because people can't come together to form these kinds of things, then it may be possible that there even is no sort of moral code, right? And Hobbes says that these qualities of morality, law, justice, are all based on men who live in society, not in solitude. And he concludes by saying that force and fraud are the cardinal virtues in the state of nature, state of war. So force, might makes right, and fraud, stealing, lying, cheating, doing whatever you have to do to survive. So not a pretty picture, right? But Hobbes does sort of end, and he ends this chapter. He doesn't actually lay out his proposal, which comes later in, but he says, look, there's a way out of the state of nature, right? It sounds like a very nasty place, right? And he says that in addition to sort of these notions of self-preservation, nature's also provided us with a couple of capacities that can help us figure out a way out of the state of nature, right? And one, he says, is our passions, right? Our emotions. We have this fear of death, we have a desire for comfort, and we have hopes of being able to do great things with our lives. So those things can motivate us to try to figure out a way to get out of the state of nature, right? And he says we also have our rationality, and our rationality can dictate to us that it doesn't make sense for us to live in a society where our lives are going to be short and nasty and brutish and things like that. So not only do we have an emotional reason to want to get out of the state of nature, but we also have a rational reason to want to do so as well. And Hobbes thinks that these two things together are what ultimately compel us to create sovereign governments. So Hobbes says, look, creating a state, creating a government it's not just a religious thing. It's not a religious thing. It's just it's a survival thing, right? It's a thing that if we want to prosper as a people and as a culture, this is something that we have to do. Right? Even though life in a state, you may have to give up some of your freedom, things like that. It may not be the most just state. Hobbes would make the argument that it's better to live in an unjust state, an unjust society with a government than it is to live in the state of nature with no government at all. Okay, so that's a very brief introduction to Hobbes' chapter 13, where he sort of lays out this stuff. And then I want you guys to actually sort of see how this plays out in the Cormac McCarthy, the film based on the book by Cormac McCarthy and Viggo Mortensen, The Road, where you actually see these folks living in the state of nature, and you actually see what happens. Okay, so that's it for this week. I'll post the discussion question on Wednesday. As I said, I'm going to break you guys down into small groups. I'll post those on the website as well. And if you guys have any questions, let me know. Have a good week.